So hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Hopefully you can hear me all okay. So as Ted said, my name is Bill Bittner, and I kind of got addicted to this place after stopping in last summer. I guess I've been here just over a year. I'm still on probation, as they tell me, but I'm trying my best. Along with being a docent here and giving tours, I also started a YouTube channel. And so earlier this year, I was thinking about something to do. A lot of what my channel is about just me hiking and wandering and talking out loud. And going through the first floor, there's a poster down there about the 57 men, IBM Endicotters, that were killed in World War II. And I recalled that there's a monument to that, and I thought that might make a good video. And so I did that in time for Memorial Day. I kind of gave the other volunteers here a sneak peek the Saturday before. They gave me a couple hints, but gave me the thumbs up. And then discussion of that said, well, maybe that would be something that other people might be interested in. And I've done a lot more research on it, and it's just something that's I feel drawn to. Now, I'm not a historian by nature. I'm more of a story collector and a storyteller. I like the mystery of trying to understand what was going on in different times and the threads that connect those different things. And so we're going to walk through some of this. Now, I'll apologize in advance. I can get long-winded, so if anybody has to leave, I won't be hurt too much. When I did my practice run of this, it was 2 hours and 43 minutes, but I cut it down way down. So I did want to acknowledge some people. Joe Titi, who's also has done tours here as a docent. He's the one that originally pulled together that poster down there and did a lot of the legwork to get me started on understanding these 57 men. Also, just the Historical Society for giving me an opportunity here. Thank you, Donna, for taking it to the board to suggest I present here. So if this isn't good, you can blame Donna. Right? Also, the Richardson family, I'll tell you how they're tied into this, and Dennis Camarda over at Endicott Artistic Memorials, the help he gave me there. So I'm going to cover the 57 men. Now, obviously, I can't go into a lot of detail on all 57, or we really will be here for hours. But I'll try to touch on a number of them. I'll touch on the monument itself, and then I'm going to take one man's life out of that, one that impacted me quite a bit in learning about him and sharing that with you. I'll take questions as we go. I prefer that the questions have to do with something I'm talking about. Otherwise, I might ask you to hold off till later on that. So I think we'll start with, I should point out that on my website that goes along with this, I have all the men there and more details if you want to get more information on that. Instead of me just reading off the names, I'm just going to give you the clip of the video that shows the men. It's about 7 minutes, but it'll go through all 57 relatively quickly. Also, I thought that in light of this being the anniversary of 9/11, and with these men, when the video ends, it will just fade to black, and I'll give us a moment of silence just to reflect on that. All right? So anything that strike you in that? I know every time I watch it, it kind of gets me again about how young those men were. The ages, yep.
They seem older.
Yeah, I was surprised. We'll look at the age demographics in a little bit more detail. It really spread the gamut more than you might have thought. Uh, but yeah, we'll look at that. So I'm gonna, yep.
You know, it's unsettling that such a large percentage of the IBM were killed. 150 people, 57 people.
Well, so from Endicott, there were 2,700 that went into service for World War II. Of all of IBM, there was 115 that were killed. 57 of them were Endicott. Yeah, so from that perspective, right? But back in that era, Endicott was huge. In fact, you know, IBM Poughkeepsie didn't really exist until World War II. Right? It was started as a munitions factory. But yeah, that's a good point.
Most of them were Army Air Corps, the prisoners to the Air Force.
Yeah, so that's a good observation. We'll talk about that too. Actually, you want to come up here and I can. No, we don't. You don't want to? Okay. All right. So we're gonna look. Yep.
And the dates, December 25th, December 24th. I can't imagine that going home to family. And that's what you heard.
Yeah. There were multiples of that around different holidays like that that were hard to see. So I'm going to look at this in a little bit more now. Some of this is going to kind of come out like statistics, but I assure you, I don't mean to diminish the individuality or the humanity of these men. It's just kind of the way that my brain works sometimes in trying to pull things together. So bear with me with that, and we'll look through that. So what I have here is all 57 men, and when they went into service. Now, from this perspective, I consider whether they draft, inducted, commissioned because of ROTC, all the same thing. So when they went in and then when they died in service here. And to put it a little bit into context, so Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 41, D-Day, June 6th, 44, victory in Europe and victory in Japan. So you can see we had a number that had already gone in prior to Pearl Harbor. And then pretty much everybody was in before D-Day. There were a few others for various reasons there. There are some that you might have noticed from the ages, they may have gone in earlier if they were older, right? Some of those 19 and 20-year-olds basically enlisted as soon as they could. Right? And so also with that, you can kind of think that the longer that bar is, the longer they were serving, the longer they were in combat. And so there are a few that stood out there. The first one, Corporal William Wilson, he was with a medical battalion over in the Pacific. So he started in Australia where they staged a lot of stuff. If you ever watched the HBO miniseries The Pacific, think of that aspect there. You will see him. He would then go on and fight as kind of the tide turns and we go from the defensive to the offensive of the Pacific. He ends up being killed in the Philippines. So in Luzon, we'll talk a little bit about that. He had just over 4 years. Weeks before he was killed, he had written home to tell them, I think I'm going to be moved to the back, away from the front lines, and I should be discharged soon. And so, and then another gentleman, Sergeant Raymond Abbey, just shy of 4 years service. He would also be killed in the Philippines in Luzon a little bit later, or around March of 45. So two gentlemen that served a long time there. Okay. I'm also going to look at it now in terms of how the deaths occurred, right? And one of the things you can see is once we get to D-Day, deaths occur more often, right? The action gets more intense, and we lose more and more soldiers that way. But the first one of the Endicotters to be killed was Sergeant Gerald Ludlam. He was a paratrooper. He died in action in the invasion of Sicily. So he served in the Northern African campaigns, and then as we crossed over the Mediterranean, taking Sicily and Italy, he would be killed there. He's buried in Italy, in Lazio, Italy. And then there were a number that were involved in the Normandy invasion in D-Day. Two in particular that died right on D-Day were Petty Officer Leonard Landon. He was Navy. And I'm going to guess that most of us have seen Saving Private Ryan. So that opening scene of coming onto the beach, you see the soldiers coming in what they call the Higgins boats. So there's little boats where the ramp falls down the front. Leonard Landon was one of the pilots on one of those. We don't often think about the Navy men that served in there as well. And their job was to drop the soldiers off and then go back and get more. And so he was killed there. And then Private First Class Stephen Gordon was also killed on the beaches of Normandy. He was 19 years old. So he was one of those that enlisted pretty much as soon as he could. He was a combat engineer. So if you're familiar with the tactics there, they were responsible and key to going on the beach, removing mines, also blowing up structures that were going to hinder the Allies coming into the beach. And so his unit was very important there. And so he would died very young. And then another gentleman, First Lieutenant William Broadley, and here's where some of the data gets fuzzy. Some things report him being killed on June 6th, but to the best of my knowledge, from what I put together, it was really later. Now, he didn't land on the beach. He was part of an airborne unit. Now, most of us know about the airborne units in terms of the paratroopers that would parachute in individually. There were also glider forces. So you picture this, it's a glider with no engine. It's about 50 feet long, 80-foot wingspan. There's a pilot and co-pilot there just kind of steering it. Not that you can do much than steer. You can't go higher. You can only go lower. And maybe 12 other men in that, or maybe a few other men in a jeep or a piece of artillery. And these would be taken up, pulled up usually by a cargo plane, cable released, and they would glide in silently. That was part of it behind the lines to take out strategic spots. These planes were typically used once because they kind of just crash landed. They kind of had skids that would come in. Lieutenant Broadley was on one of these gliders. I don't know the exact way he was killed, but he did die in action there on June 14th of 44. Okay. Also, we have some that died very late in the war. And this was upsetting to me too in terms of this gentleman, Second Lieutenant Louis Fairtig. And I apologize if I butcher any names. Correct me if you know how to pronounce these names and I get it wrong, let me know, please. So he was a Navy pilot. He was with a group, a division that was responsible for moving planes around. They called it a ferry command. Because here we are cranking out planes all over the place in the US, but they have to get to the right place. And so he was with a group that would move them. He was scheduled to fly from Jackson, Mississippi to Shreveport, Louisiana, and he never showed up. And you have to remember, back in that time frame, we didn't have the radar and the radio and all that to the same degree we do now to track things. And so they just know he didn't show up. A week or so later, a farmer reports there's a plane in one of his fields. And he was flying a two-passenger, two-person Grumman Avenger dive bomber. That whether it was weather or mechanical or a combination crashed. And so that was June 13th of 45, so very late in the war. The other passenger with him also died. Another one that was killed late in the war was Seaman Walter Alestic. He served on a U.S. destroyer, a Navy destroyer, the USS Batch. This is one that saw a lot of action in the Pacific. It was at Iwo Jima and other places. They, just prior to the Battle of Okinawa, they went to the aid of another Navy ship, saved 74 men whose ship was sinking. They go forward into Okinawa, the battle there, and at this point in the war, the Japanese are both desperate and committed. And so this is the era in which the kamikaze dive bombers involved. And so 2 dive bombers just took their planes into this destroyer and sank it. And so Seaman Alestic and 40 other crewmen were killed in that. Question: the ship didn't sink, but it was immobile at that point. Also, I already mentioned earlier, William Wilson was in that era too, and a few others that were late in the wars there that were killed. So we talked about age a little bit. So here you kind of see the whole scale now, and there were a lot of all sorts of ages. A lot young, a lot of the older, and well, at my point right now in life, 37 is young, right? So our 2 youngsters are teenagers. I can't wrap my head around that they were teenagers. And others were probably teenagers when they went in. We already mentioned Private Gordon. Private First Class Harold Kenner was another one of these infantry glider men. Only his combat where he perished was in the Netherlands or Holland. So for the war buffs, this was Operation Market Garden, where we were trying to get a foothold on some strategic bridges over the Rhine River. And so his group flew in, and he was presumed dead. Now, this is one of these scenarios where they reported him as dead, but they never found his body. Decades later, in '87, somebody reports a body or body remains in a farm somewhere or some woods. And so the Netherlands, the authorities look at it and stuff, and they start communicating back and forth with the Americans. And one of the things that I learned about this is how tragic it is that there are still 70,000 men and women that served whose remains haven't been identified and connected. His was one of them. So these remains were sent to the U.S. We looked at them, but we couldn't figure that out. They were sent back to the Netherlands. And then in 2001, we found some other information from some other remains or something of other servicemen that were in that unit. And so we asked the Netherlands for the remains back. And they were able to identify then, I think it was in 2011, that, yeah, they had solved that this was Private Kenner there. And so I just can't imagine the uncertainty of that, both from a family and friends perspective. Okay. On the upper end, we have Corporal Arthur Crawl. He was an infantryman, and he would die in France, fighting there sometime after the Normandy invasion, as we're moving in, kind of around the same time as the Battle of the Bulge. He's buried in the Nozay, France. That was one of the things that also was kind of interesting to me, and a thread I ended up following was a lot of these servicemen are buried all over the globe. Normandy, I already mentioned the guys there, Italy, France, the Netherlands, the Philippines. And a lot of that was wanting to be respectful and also just the practicality of what we're going to do with all these bodies, which is a horrible thing to even have to think about. In following that thread, I found kind of the coolest story, and I apologize, I can't remember the exact soldier's name now, but it was a soldier who was buried in Italy, and there was a family there that kind of adopted his grave. And they would go and visit him, and they connected with the family back here. And just, and so that kind of stuff happened. Now, there were times where several of the soldiers would be exhumed and moved back here to the States, or in some of these cases, um, there'll be a grave here that's an empty one, but representative of them. All right. Uh, other older guys. We're going to talk about Corporal Joseph Salata later. He's the one focal one. Sergeant Milton Roseboom was an infantryman. He's out of Port Crane, and he was killed in Guam. So Guam was one of the first places we lost to the Japanese, and we took that back later in the war. He's buried over in Vestal Hills Cemetery there. Machinist mate First Class Curtis Oliver, and this is one where I'm not exact on some of the dates because sometimes people write 7s and they look like 9s on forms back then. But as best as I can tell, he was 35. He served also on a destroyer, the USS, the USS Leary, which was an old one. It was built in 1918. And so if you've ever seen the movie Greyhound, that's the Tom Hanks movie with the escorting convoys across the Atlantic during World War II, I now look at that differently. And so the USS Leary and Oliver and his crews would escort convoys across the Atlantic multiple times. The destroyer got beat up a little bit, so they put it into port in Boston in 43, got it fixed up a little bit, put some newer equipment on it, and sent it off. Now this time, they sent it off on what they called a hunter-killer expedition. So instead of trying to protect a convoy, they were actually going in search of German U-boats. And as fate would have it, they found one. Unfortunately, they found a whole pack of them, or what was sometimes referred to as a pack of U-boats. And they were with other ships, but unfortunately the Leary was sank there. Oliver died in that explosion. The other ships did take out some of those U-boats, but it's still very tragic. Okay. We talked about officers, or rather, what branch of the service. And so in this era, as Tom was saying, we kind of morphed from the U.S. Army Air Corps, then for a while there was like kind of the Army Air Forces, and it wasn't really the Air Forces as we know today. But I kind of lumped all that under the Air Force here, except for my Navy pilot, I kept him under the Navy. A couple Marines and one Coast Guard. So Fireman First Class Howard Sitgreaves, another young man, and we don't often think about the Coast Guard, but they were quite involved. You know, not just protecting the coast, but they were also often responsible for doing escorts of these convoys again. So the movie Greyhound, as we moved things from the East Coast up to sometimes staged in Iceland, and it was there that the destroyer he was on, the USS Leopold, was attacked. And it would go down, himself and a number of other men would die there. This is one I want to do some more research on because there were accounts taken from the survivors. There were several survivors from that destroyer, as well as they got accounts from the other side. So from crew, some German sailors that were on the U-boat that sank it. And out of that came the book, Never to Return. So it's on my bookshelf. I'm going to get to it because I want to understand more about this young man and the men that he served with. The other thing that, and Tom kind of mentioned it, was the number of like folks in the Air Force, Air Corps, and even like when I look into what they actually did, there were an awful lot of pilots there. And I'm like, well, is that a coincidence or what? I mean, I knew in World War II, the life expectancy of a pilot wasn't very high. But still, what was going on? And while I was looking for something for Louis Fertig, I found this article about Tri-Cities Airport. So back there, we didn't have Binghamton Airport yet. Linkfield didn't come in until September of 1950. Tri-Cities, though, started in 34 and was commissioned in 36. And we apparently did all sorts of stuff down there. It was just gravel runways, but they were doing training, right? And then I started realizing, well, you know, we had Edwin Link in this area too. And you got the Curtis folks over in Havensport building planes. So, you know, this area does have an aviation kind of nature to it as well. And so I think that's my theory anyway, explaining why a lot of our young men went into flying or related to aviation. So Louis Fertig is the gentleman on the far left there. I want to try to track down the other ones and see if they ended up serving it as well. And that also came through. I found another gentleman that we showed here, Harold Corey, who was a pilot. His father had been a pilot in World War I and had been shot down. And so that thread there kind of made me have to stop for a little bit. Okay. From a rank perspective, anybody from private up to captain. Our captain was Wendell J. Root. He would die when he was 24. He was a pilot over in the Pacific, so he's flying the big B-17 bombers. And even more tragic is the plane he went down in, he wasn't even flying. They were moving people around, so he was a passenger. So there was a crew of 5 and then 14 others. And this plane crashes off of New Guinea. And he's killed there at age 24. Now, he kind of got a jump in terms of his rank because he had gone ROTC, so Reserve Officer Training, and so came into the service at a higher rank then. Okay, so I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about that memorial, what happened there. And so, in looking at this, in ways it was refreshing because it reminded me about IBM being a family and a community. Just like EJ and Wade, where it was difficult to distinguish the employees and the employers and the company. It was all just one thing, right? And I didn't realize this, but the monument that we'll talk about, IBM, the corporation, didn't pay for that. The people did. They formed a war memorial committee through that. They put out a vote to, at that time there were 7,500 IBMers. They gave them 4 choices of things to do. I'm glad they didn't pick the room in the country club because that would be gone. Right? Now, the other thing that struck me was 80% of the people actually voted. I voted on a lot of things at IBM, and it wasn't often that it was 80% unless it was like a mandatory thing, right? So people were interested and invested in this. The funds, as I said, were raised. There were all sorts of fundraisers. There was like a fashion show or something run at one spot. What did they call it? A style show. So over $20,000. The monument itself was $20,000. So in today's dollars, that would be $275,000. So a little over $250,000. So we'll let that sit in for a little while. So they're going to work with, at the time, John Benanzi over at Endicott Artistic Memorials, who works with Vermont Marble Company. Now, you might be like me and not have ever heard of Vermont Marble Company before, but you probably have seen things from them. So Vermont Marble Company was involved with the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is from them. Parts of the White House. The other thing, too, is this little town of Proctor, Vermont, where they're at, is very similar to a city or town called Endicott that grew up around wise leadership and an industry like EJ Shoes. Except in this case, it was marble, and there was a guy named Redfield Proctor who pulled a bunch of separate marble producers together and grew to be one of the largest marble companies in the world, and one of the largest companies. In the turn of the century, they had like 5,000 people working for them. And it was very much, as I found out talking to some people that had lived there, it was like here, everybody knew everybody, right? And sort of looked out for one another, right? Everything's marble. Even the bridge, one of the bridges coming into town is all marble. So I'm taking a road trip. If anybody wants to come with me sometime, you gotta check this out. So there's 2 key people there. Earl Richardson, who's kind of the artistic one around this. He's going to be the one that pulls the design together and works with the folks here as to how do we really represent and honor these men. And then a man by the name of Louis Lertola, who's, I don't think this is his real title, but I just made it up, the lead production engineer. He's the one that's going to figure out how we take this marble and make it into this monument without it cracking, apparently. Right? And so pretty cool. So we're going to have a ceremony. They'd raised the money. ceremony set for August 16th of 47. A bunch of speakers there. 3 representatives from the War Memorial are going to speak. Thomas Watson Sr., 2 representatives of the military, 2 clergy, somebody does an opening and then a benediction. The chorus, of course, there's an IBM chorus. They're going to sing there as well. There's also 4 wreaths laid there. One who if anybody knows Richard Taylor from IBM Plant 1, I'd like to learn more about him. He's on my list. He laid 1 wreath to represent the workers. Each of the military raised 1. And then there was a Mrs. Lawrence Smith who represented the Gold Star family, so the families of those that lost people. And she was the mother of Lawrence W. Smith, Jr., who was 22 when he was killed. He, again, was in the Air Corps, and his plane went down off the coast of Denmark. This was in 43, I believe. And so we're running missions even before D-Day over in there. And then, just when I think about, all right, I noticed that he's a junior. And there won't be Lawrence W. Smith III. He wasn't married, he had no children at that point. Rifle volley and tap send, and then Thomas Watson invites all the Gold Star families up to what was the homestead now, it's the Tradition Spa now, right, with the other dignitaries to have a lunch there. So the 2 military speakers, the first one was Major General Maxwell Taylor. He at the time is in charge of West Point. He kind of earned his stripes in World War II. He was the commander of the 101st Airborne, and got that. He goes on a fairly successful career from that perspective, be a chairman of the chief of staffs. Yeah, he spoke in there about the idea that we need to honor these men by continuing to work towards freedom, and was pretty bold about that. And then the other man was Commodore Robert G. Tobin. So he's essentially in charge of all the Navy ports in New York City. He had gone through World War II and rose pretty quickly there. He had been a captain or commander of a destroyer, and then later on commanding a whole destroyer group. And he was in the Pacific, and so at times I'm thinking, I wonder if he knew our guys that were on destroyers, or at least had an appreciation for that. And in his speech, he quotes Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, or part of it. And it was just so fitting in terms of, and I can't do it justice, but the idea of Lincoln speaking at Gettysburg about the dedicating of that soil was not just for the dead, but for the living. And that we are called to follow the devotion that those men did in terms of freedom for all men and unity. And so Commodore Tobin presents that the same way now, that these 57 men should not have perished in a sense that we not carry forward what they gave us, right? And Thomas Watson, paralleled that as well in terms of talking about an inheritance we had from that freedom. And so I just found it pretty powerful. So August in Endicott, go figure, was kind of a cloudy day. So I haven't found great pictures. If anybody knows of any great pictures from that day, I'd love to see it. But you see the Commodore here, Edward James, who's one of the War Memorial people, Thomas Watson, and then the Major General Taylor on the other side, and then the Honor Guard and the Rifle Squad. So here is where it is now over in Highland Park, right? So the country club is being sold. At some point, somebody goes, wait, we have a monument there. I don't know if they said it just like that, but they realized that it needed to be moved, and the orchestrated how to do that. And they decided it would be fitting to put it in Highland Park since IBM donated that land to the town in '59, so that would be a good place for it. They enlisted Endicott Artistic Memorials again, And so this is when I talked to Dennis Camargo about it. I'm like, how do you move that? I said, how do you move something like that? Because it's like 14,000 pounds. And he goes, well, we're used to lifting and moving big things. The hard part was, how was that put together? Because there weren't any blueprints or anything left, right? It's sort of like if any of us have like tried to get trim off a car at some point, like, I don't know how this comes apart, right? Except this is marble now, so he's got like one shot. But he was able to do that. They were able to move it. They also found inside there's a copper cylinder, right, where all the names of the people are listed in that, as well as they didn't open it, but we thought also copies of the speeches. So it was rededicated on Veterans Day of 2005, and IBM has continued to put wreaths there on Veterans Day. I personally think Memorial Day would be better, but they didn't ask me, so. But next Memorial Day, I'll probably be over there at some point. Come join me. You'll see on the monument here, it starts out with those 4 steps at the base there, and those are representative of the 4 freedoms. And I mean, these guys just thought through what this was meant to be, right? And so we hear freedom of speech all the time, especially when I say something that somebody else doesn't want to hear. But different than freedom of religion. And then these other 2 that I had to ponder for a little bit, freedom from what and freedom from fear. And I hadn't heard it put that way. And then I stopped to think about, there was an EJ slogan, which I hope I get right, live and help live. Kind of sounds, and just that aspect of it being a community and not expecting somebody else to do stuff for you. I thought was pretty poignant. And then on the front, a sword, a just war, and olive branches are kind of hard to see, but they're up in here, signifying peace in that. And then very patriotic. Watson was very direct in terms of the importance of the Americans getting involved in the war and that turning the tide. So the American eagle at the top of that with the USA there. And then the 57 names carved in there, which I kind of want to know how they did that, because I would be so scared of getting to like the last name. That's something that they were able to touch up a little bit. They didn't need it a lot, but when they moved it, they handled that. And then this little inscription here, which sometimes you can miss if you don't look closely, a grateful tribute from their fellow employees. So again, this idea that this is from your coworkers, and they really felt that, right? So after the ceremony, the next year, they put together a commemorative book. We have a copy of this over in the library. I've also scanned one, and it's on my website if you're interested in that. And they gave it to all the Gold Star families. It has some of the speeches in there, and so it's kind of cool to look at that and read through that. Inside that program is this picture. This is where the monument had been over at the country club, just below the 10th tee, I believe. Something a little different. There used to be an internal flame. I'm not exactly sure when the upkeep fell down that they didn't keep the flame going. When it moved, they weren't able to move it in such a way so that there's no longer a flame. We have to represent that flame now ourselves, right? And that's partly why I'm doing this. Okay. So I said sometimes there's a story behind a story. So I put in my video Memorial Day, and I get a message from Georgia Burbage, who was an IBMer, and she was involved with the monument being moved. And she goes, you know somebody that was related to the folks that built that monument. I'm like, I do? She goes, yes. And then pretty soon, I got another message. And so while I had been over there, I'd been sitting on this park bench there. Sometimes just sitting trying to figure out what I was going to say. Sometimes I'd have my equipment there as I'm doing filming. And I suppose if I had looked closer, there's a plaque behind this. So the other contact I got was by a gentleman named John Richardson. So remember I said there were 2 people at Vermont Marble? Earl Richardson? Well, Earl and Pearl Richardson, son Robert, and Lois and Dorothy Lertolas daughter Jean fell in love. And they played tennis, and then it started, I don't know. They get married. He goes off to Korea with the U.S. Army. He comes back. Because part of me, I'm thinking, well, yeah, but how did they get down in this boot camp? So Robert ends up getting a job with IBM. Very briefly at IBM Endicott because he's really going to Owego, but Owego hasn't been built yet or completed. So he ends up at IBM Owego. He works for the Apollo space program while he's there. They raise their family in Broome County. One of their children, John, married Ardeen, who was a third generation IBMer, so he's kind of connected into IBM that way. And so the family put this bench there in honor of the grandparents. And so I got to spend the better part of an afternoon hearing a lot of stories and just really loving to hear. And that's a lot where I learned, again, the similarities of Proctor, Vermont, and Endicott, New York. So, yeah, some cool stuff. And it's fun. They have like family pictures. Like, I don't know how many great grandkids there are now, but they got pictures of all of them there with that. And it's just a cool thing for the family. Okay. So I wanted to talk about one man's story, and that man in particular is Joseph John Salata. His family was in Boston Spa, so up north of Albany, and then moved down here to this area when he was a child. He graduated from Union Endicott. Does anybody know about St. Procopius College? Yeah, I didn't either. So today it's known as the Benedictine University. It's out in Illinois. It was a college originally run by the monks of the Abbey out there for young Catholic men of Czech and Slavic background. So that's going to be on the quiz next time. And at one time he had thought about going into the priesthood. He comes back here. He's working for IBM Endicott starting in 32. He also becomes a member of the Knights of Columbus. And then he goes off to service. So in March 24th of 41, so that's well before Pearl Harbor. He ends up being a corporal in the U.S. Army Air Corps. So again, we're talking about the Air Corps. But he's in a group, the 83rd Engineer Battalion. And they're going to be over in the Philippines. So for those like me that are geographically challenged, the Philippines are these set of islands, right, east of what today is known as Vietnam, south of Taiwan and Japan. Australia is off my map down here, right? But this was really important to us at the time because of the location and where all the aggression of Japan was taking place. Now the Philippines also at this time, remember, were basically an American colony. You know, there's a plan for independence, and then World War II happens, right? So they will get their independence later on. And so the idea in 40 and 41 is to fortify the Philippines. So as I said, it's a group of islands. The largest one is Luzon here. And we're going to build a number of airfields there and ports. There are some things in there already, and just kept growing that. Corporal Salata is going to be based in Clarkfield. So that's just kind of north of this Manila Bay. This region here is known as the Bataan Peninsula. We'll come back to that. So they're there, they're trying to do stuff. If you read stuff from that era, there's hindsight in terms of we probably didn't give as much support there early enough as we should. So the Philippines and Hawaii, the Philippines are 6 hours earlier. So 8 a.m. in the morning in Pearl Harbor is 2 a.m. in the Philippines. It is the next day, though, because we're across the international date line. Don't think about that too much. Hours after Pearl Harbor, they attack the Philippines as well. And lots of miscues here. Word got sent to the Philippines, but General MacArthur was the commander at that time. They didn't wake him up. They weren't sure about it. And so because of that, we didn't put aircraft up in the air fast enough. We made a lot of mistakes. We were just slow to react. And as a result of that, it wasn't good. And so the Japanese invade from multiple points. They get a beachhead established. They take out a lot of our planes that are still on the ground. And it's just chaos happening. In March, President Roosevelt's going to tell MacArthur, you have to get out of there. And that's where MacArthur makes his famous line of, I shall return, right? The Americans are going to keep retreating. They're getting overrun. Their last stand is going to be in that Bataan Peninsula down there, and making their final defense there. But they're going to eventually surrender, right? They were out of resources, out of food, and for whatever reason, they thought that was the right thing to do. And so with that, the Corporal Salada is captured. And then begins the Bataan Death March, which some of you may have heard of. So a 65-mile forced march of these prisoners, 75,000 American and Filipino. They were fighting alongside us. It was their land. They were fighting just as hard. Many died on the way. It's just brutal. The Japanese continued to take over the rest of it. Eventually, Manila itself falls, which was the capital. And Salada is eventually going to be moved back down there. And so in what's called a Bilibid, today there's an old Bilibid and a new Bilibid prison. And so it wasn't the worst of the camps, but it still wasn't great. And he would be, now you also have to remember that it is chaos in the Philippines, right? The Japanese have overrun all sorts of areas. So from lots of different angles, we don't know if people are dead. Some people just hid out in the jungle. So there's a lot of guerrilla warfare that the Filipinos and Americans, conducted because they were hiding out there from the Japanese, or captured, or what. So the family's told in May of '42 that he's missing in action, as a lot are told. And so the family starts writing letters. So contacting the Red Cross, contacting their congressman, Edwin Hall, I think it was at the time, and they're like, we're not sure. So finally, a year later, they find out he's a prisoner of war. And that's just rough to think through. And so you read about what the family was going through and what the area rallying around that. And so one of my thread takes me right to this building. So Bert's on the Avenue. There was a big war bond campaign here, and the widow of Lou Gehrig was here, buying war bonds. The Knights of Columbus, to honor Salada, since he was a member, bought a $500 war bond here in Bert's Avenue. So it always comes back to this building. So they'll eventually get some news from him in January. It's a little unclear. They did hear different times from him. The first time I think was a postcard where he basically told his sister to make sure his car insurance was paid. Now, it's possible that other stuff had been removed from the letter by the Japanese in terms of treatment. But he's there, so this is now January of '44, so prior to D-Day. All right, so we're now taking territory back over in the Pacific, right? We're on the offensive from an Allies perspective. We've taken back Guam and other places. And MacArthur's still making that promise well known that he's going back to the Philippines. And so an article in January of '45 talks about the family having hope that their son, and I think there were a few other Endicotters, not necessarily IBMers, that were prisoners in Japanese camps at the time. But there's also an urgency because word has leaked out about the treatment in some of the Japanese prison camps and how atrocious that was. And also we get into this space of, again, I mentioned earlier, the Japanese desperation. So sometimes when they knew they were going to be overrun by Allies, they would just kill the prisoners off. That made it easy, because that way the prisoners couldn't come back to fight against them when they were liberated. Or what would often happen is they'd be moved off to work in labor camps, right? Put in these ships that were sometimes referred to as hell ships. So they're basically freighters meant to move cargo that are now moving thousands of men in very unsanitation areas. And such was the fate of Salada and many of the other prisoners in Bilibid. So on October 21st of '44, they're put on this ship here, the Arasan Maru. I think it was like 1,800 or so in that little ship. That ship is part of a larger group of ships, 17 all total. 3 of them are Japanese destroyers. And they set sail out of that. They're going to go to Tako, which is on the southern tip of Taiwan. So if you remember that map, Japanese still control that. They're going to go to work there. Now, that freighter was kind of slow. It had like a peak speed of 8 miles per hour, which I'm almost faster than that. And so it falls behind. And then the worst thing that could happen happens. American subs think it's a Japanese troop ship and they fire upon it. And it ends up being one of the worst friendly fire actions in World War II. So most of the prisoners get out of there. Those destroyers do turn around and come back, but they only pick up the Japanese crew. They let everybody else die at sea. Now there were a total of 9 men who survived, 9 prisoners. 4 of them were recaptured. 5 of them made it to China. Were reconnected with U.S. troops there. That's how we know a lot about what transpired there. And I can't imagine, I can't fathom that. Let's see. The family is notified in June of 45. So remember this, that he was killed in October of 44. The family is being hopeful. That article in the press was in 45, January of 45. They have no idea that he's been killed already. And so I'm trying to weigh through all that. And then I start thinking about William Wilson and Raymond Abbey, 2 of our soldiers that were killed late in the war. And they were killed on Luzon in the Philippines. They were part of the group that was fighting to liberate the Philippines, part of MacArthur's group there. And so in February of 45, they were liberated, or Manila was, but a lot of the rest of the island had not been. And so that's just one that I can't wrap my head around. It's one now, though, where if I think I'm uncomfortable or having a rough day, no, I have no clue as to what a rough day is. And it has prompted me to think differently about a lot of this stuff. So I know I've shared a lot. Do you have any questions or thoughts?
How do you remember everything?
I might forget it tomorrow.
What did IBM do for the family, the widows and children?
So I don't know all the details there. The question was, what did IBM do for the families? IBM, for the government contracts in World War II, only charged 1% profit, and that 1% went to the Gold Star families, but I'm not sure how that was done. That's something on my list to better understand. I also believe that the men that served had a small portion of their salary still going to them, but I don't know the details of that either. I don't know if anybody else does.
I noticed on one of them, excuse me, you had mentioned that they were Knights of Columbus. By any chance, did you ever see which ones were part of the Masonic organization, since they were here too in Endicott?
Yeah, the men that I've researched so far, I haven't seen any connections to the Masonic Lodge, but that's one that I'll keep my eye out for. I actually want to go talk to the Knights of Columbus at some point, because there's some interesting stuff in that war bond campaign. There's something about a sword, which I can't quite understand, that was auctioned off, and I'm not really sure what Lou Gehrig's widow was doing with the sword, but yeah, I'd like to look into that. There's a lot of threads I haven't pulled yet. Okay. Well, I have some questions for you. Oh, now you're looking nervous. So, are there other topics you want to hear about? Or maybe say, I don't want to ever hear from you again, Bill. But just some different things there. Let me know that any of the board members here or volunteers know. I'd be happy to pull some things there. Those are just some wild things that popped in my head. And you may also be asking, well, this is really cool. How can I get involved? Well, again, see myself or any of the volunteers or board members here. There's all sorts of things we need. We always need docents and storytellers, and you don't need to know everything about everything, right? Nobody does. But you know a little section, and we often hand people off as they come in through tours. I do that often because I'm still in probation. Lots of things to catalog, all sorts of other stuff to do there. And if you're saying, well, I have more money than time, we can also use money. Let us know. Right? Okay. Well, I thank you all. I know this went longer than maybe some of you thought.
Thank you.
To me, it's impactful. I mean, when I think back again to the Gettysburg Address aspects there, and that this isn't the most uplifting presentation I've ever given, but I hope it's impactful in terms of making us recognize that there were people that made supreme sacrifices for us to be able to do what we do today. And the way we honor them is by living our better lives.
It's a very appropriate presentation on September 11th.
Thank you, and be safe.